Chapter 1. Birth of a Monster. Before he became the twisted, flesh-torn horror haunting the shadows of Hawkins. Before he ruled over the Upside Down as its undisputed master. Before he even had a name that would strike terror into the hearts of those who heard it whispered in the dark, there was simply a boy. A boy born in the dry, desolate landscapes of Nevada in 1947, into a world still recovering from the wounds of global war. His name was Henry Creel, and he would become the architect of nightmares, the puppeteer pulling strings across dimensions, the monster known as Vecna. This is his story. The complete, unvarnished truth of how an innocent child transformed into something far more sinister than any demon from myth or legend. It's a tale that stretches across decades, threading through the fabric of Stranger Things like dark veins spreading through healthy tissue. Understanding Vecna means understanding the boy he once was, the choices that shaped him, and the moment when humanity itself became his greatest enemy. Henry Creel came into this world in Rachel, Nevada, a remote town where military secrets whispered on the wind and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction. His father, Victor Creel, was a World War II veteran who had seen horrors overseas that he could never quite shake from his memory. Those wartime ghosts haunted Victor in ways he didn't fully understand, manifesting as a rigid adherence to structure, order, and normalcy. His mother, Virginia, was a woman trying desperately to maintain the appearance of a perfect family despite the cracks already forming beneath the surface. And then there was Alice, Henry's sister, who represented everything their parents hoped their children would be. Bright, cheerful, uncomplicated. But Henry was different from the very beginning. He was what people in those days would call a sensitive child, someone who seemed to exist slightly out of phase with the world around him. While other children played simple games and concerned themselves with simple pleasures, Henry's mind turned inward, observing, analysing, judging. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, recognised the artificial nature of social constructs that others accepted without question. Time, he would later reflect, was one of humanity's greatest impositions on nature. The ticking of clocks, the division of days into rigid segments, the march of seconds and minutes and hours that everyone accepted as immutable truth, when in reality it was just another cage. The truly extraordinary part of Henry's story, the element that would set everything else in motion, remained somewhat mysterious in its exact origins. According to some accounts, including details from the stage production Stranger Things, the first shadow, which explores Henry's earlier years, young Henry experienced a 12-hour disappearance during his childhood. The show suggests this event involved Henry being transported to another dimension, though the full details of what occurred remain ambiguous. What we can say with certainty, based on what's shown in Season 4 of the series, is that Henry possessed psychokinetic and telepathic abilities from a relatively young age. Whether these powers were innate from birth, awakened by a dimensional encounter, or developed through some other mechanism, isn't definitively answered by the show. The stage production implies a connection between Henry and the dark entities that would later factor into his transformation, but this represents an expansion of the television canon, rather than information stated explicitly in the Netflix series. What matters most is the results. By the time the Creel family's story intersects with the events we see in Stranger Things Season 4, young Henry possessed remarkable abilities. Telepathy that allowed him to read minds and invade thoughts. Telekinesis that let him move objects and crush bones with mental force alone. Powers that made him fundamentally different, fundamentally dangerous, fundamentally isolated from everyone around him. At first, Henry's parents didn't understand what had changed in their son. Children go through phases, they told themselves. He's just different, more withdrawn, needs time to adjust after his ordeal. But the signs were there for anyone willing to look closely enough. The way small objects would move when Henry became emotional. The manner in which he seemed to know things he shouldn't, plucking thoughts from minds as easily as picking flowers from a garden. The incidents became more frequent, more pronounced, until even Virginia and Victor couldn't ignore them any longer. Chapter 2. The Move to Hawkins, 1959. When Virginia Creel's great-uncle died in early 1959, he left behind a small fortune that would forever alter the trajectory of the Creel family. This inheritance provided Victor and Virginia with an opportunity they desperately needed, a fresh start. A chance to leave behind the whispers and sideways glances of their Nevada neighbours, to relocate somewhere new where Henry might have the opportunity to be normal, or at least pass for normal. They chose Hawkins, Indiana, a small town that seemed safe, quiet, unremarkable. The kind of place where a family could blend into the fabric of everyday American life. The house they purchased sat on Moorhead Street, a large Victorian structure with more rooms than they needed, and a history they didn't know. It was an imposing building, all angles and shadows, with a grandfather clock standing sentinel in the main hall. That clock would become important, though no one understood its significance at the time. To Victor and Virginia, it was simply part of the house's charm, an elegant timepiece that added character to their new home. To Henry, it represented something else entirely, another symbol of humanity's obsession with order, with measuring and controlling time itself. The move to Hawkins didn't provide the healing balm Victor and Virginia had hoped for. If anything, Henry's condition, his differentness, only became more pronounced. He started attending Hawkins High School, where he was immediately marked as an outsider. The new kid is always subject to scrutiny, but Henry went beyond mere newness. There was something fundamentally unsettling about him, something other students picked up on instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. They called him broken, strange, wrong. The label of being a sensitive boy followed him like a shadow, though it hardly captured the full scope of what Henry Creel truly was. During this period, Henry found solace in an unexpected place, the bathroom vent of the Creel House, where a nest of black widow spiders had made their home. While most people would recoil from such a discovery, Henry was fascinated. He spent hours observing these creatures, studying their behaviour, understanding their nature. To him, the black widow represented perfection in predatory form. They were small, yes, and therefore misunderstood and underestimated. But they were also apex predators in their own right. Creatures that existed outside the artificial moral frameworks humans imposed on nature. The spider didn't question whether killing was right or wrong. It simply did what its nature demanded. Henry began sketching, putting his thoughts and observations to paper. His drawings depicted massive spider-like creatures, fantastical beasts that combined the elegant lethality of the Black Widow with a scale that would inspire true terror. These weren't just idle doodles of a troubled teenager. They were blueprints, though Henry didn't consciously recognise them as such at the time. Years later, when he found himself in another dimension entirely, these childhood drawings would provide the template for something far more terrible than his young mind could have imagined. The grandfather clock in the Creel House became another focal point for Henry. There was something about its steady, rhythmic ticking that both repelled and compelled him. He would stand before it, watching the pendulum swing back and forth, listening to the mechanical precision of its movement. It represented everything he despised about human civilization: the need to measure, to quantify, to impose arbitrary structure on the natural flow of existence. Yet he also recognized its power as a symbol. If time was humanity's invention, then a clock was its most potent representation. And Henry was beginning to understand that symbols held tremendous power over the human mind. The stage play The First Shadow explores Henry's high school years in greater detail, depicting his connections with young versions of familiar characters. In that telling, a student named Patty Newby showed Henry kindness when others rejected him, suggesting that he could use his abilities for good. The play portrays a moment where the darker influence within Henry took control, during an incident involving Patty's father, though Henry managed to regain control and prevent the man's death. Whether these specific events occurred precisely as dramatised, they paint a picture of Henry as someone struggling with forces beyond his control, at least initially. What we know for certain from the series is that by the time the Creel family had been in Hawkins for a few months, Henry had stopped struggling against his darker impulses entirely. His resentment toward humanity, toward the social structures and artificial moralities that governed human behaviour, crystallized into something harder and more toxic. He saw people as inherently flawed, desperately trying to impose meaning and order on a universe that cared nothing for their petty concerns. They created clocks to measure time, laws to govern behaviour, social hierarchies to determine worth. All of it was artificial, a house of cards built by weak creatures trying to deny their own irrelevance. And Henry? Henry was beginning to understand that he was different, better, a predator in a world of prey. Chapter 3. The Massacre, March 1959. The Creel House had always been filled with tension, but in the spring of 1959, that tension transformed into something darker and more oppressive. Henry had stopped even pretending to be normal. He let his true nature show through in subtle ways at first, then increasingly overt ones. Objects would move without being touched. The lights flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Strange sounds echoed through the hallways at night, sounds that couldn't be explained by old pipes or settling foundations. Victor tried to rationalize these occurrences, clinging to mundane explanations because the alternative was simply too terrifying to contemplate. But Virginia knew. Mothers have a way of sensing when something is fundamentally wrong with their child. She had noticed the changes in Henry long before Victor did. The way he looked at people, as if they were insects under glass, rather than fellow human beings, worthy of empathy or consideration. The cold, calculating expression that would cross his face when he thought no one was watching. The drawings of monstrous spiders that filled his notebooks, sketches that somehow managed to be both beautiful and deeply disturbing. Virginia loved her son, but she was also beginning to fear him in a way that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she had brought into the world. What drove Henry to finally act on his impulses remained tied to his own warped philosophy. He had grown to despise his family, seeing them as representatives of everything he found contemptible about humanity. His father, with his rigid adherence to normalcy and social propriety, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of a perfect American family. His mother, with her growing fear and suspicion, looking at him as if he were something monstrous rather than her own, flesh and blood. And Alice, who embodied what Henry saw as shallow cheerfulness, going through life without questioning, never seeing beneath the surface of things. He began to use his powers to torment them, not overtly at first, but in ways that would unsettle and disturb. Objects disappearing and reappearing in wrong places. Whispers in the dark that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Images projected directly into their minds. Visions of decay, of death, of realities far darker than the comfortable suburban existence they tried to maintain. Henry enjoyed watching them crack under the pressure, seeing the fear creep into their eyes, observing as their perfect family facade crumbled piece by piece. Victor, in his desperation, began to believe the house itself was cursed. It was easier for him to accept that explanation, that some external force was responsible for the horror unfolding within his home, than to acknowledge the truth about his own son. He told himself stories about demons and evil spirits, anything to avoid seeing what was really happening. That willful blindness would eventually cost Victor everything. March 14th, 1959. That was the night everything changed, the night when Henry Creel stopped holding back and allowed his true nature to manifest fully. The exact sequence of events remains somewhat unclear, lost in the chaos and violence of what occurred, but certain facts are indisputable. On that night, Virginia and Alice Creel died in ways that defied medical explanation. Their bones were broken systematically, their bodies twisted and contorted into positions that shouldn't have been physically possible. Their eyes remained open, forever frozen in expressions of absolute terror. It was as if they had witnessed something so horrifying that their minds simply couldn't process it, breaking under the weight of pure fear. Henry orchestrated the entire event with cold precision. He used his psychokinetic abilities to lift his mother and sister into the air, suspending them helplessly as he invaded their minds with visions of their deepest traumas and fears. For his mother, he showed her the truth about her son, stripping away any last vestiges of hope or love, and replacing them with the certain knowledge that she had given birth to something fundamentally wrong, something that should never have existed. For Alice, he simply showed her the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of reality, the vast and uncaring universe that existed beyond humanity's comforting illusions. Both women's bodies gave out before their minds did, bones snapping as Henry's telekinetic grip tightened, life draining away as they hung suspended in mid-air. Victor was spared, though whether this was mercy or cruelty remains open to interpretation. Henry could have killed his father just as easily as he killed his mother and sister, but instead he chose to knock him unconscious. Perhaps some small part of Henry, some fading ember of the boy he had once been, couldn't quite bring himself to murder his father. Or perhaps, more cynically, Henry simply recognised that leaving Victor alive to be blamed for the murders would cause more suffering in the long run than a quick death. Victor would spend the rest of his life in an institution branded as a family annihilator, his mind fractured by trying to reconcile what he believed happened with what actually occurred. The official story, the one that newspapers would report, and that the town of Hawkins would whisper about for years to come, was that Victor Creel had suffered a psychotic break and murdered his family in a fit of madness. He had been a veteran after all, and everyone knew that the war did things to men's minds. The strange occurrences in the house leading up to the murders were dismissed as Victor's pre-existing mental illness manifesting itself. The physical evidence that should have called this explanation into question, the impossibility of Victor's supposed methods, was explained away or ignored entirely. Because the alternative, that a teenage boy could do such things through sheer force of will, was simply too impossible to accept. Henry was found unconscious at the scene, assumed to be another victim of his father's rampage. When he awoke in the hospital, he played the role of traumatized survivor perfectly. But he wasn't fooling everyone. Virginia Creel, in the days before her death, had reached out to someone who specialized in the impossible, who studied phenomena that existed at the edges of conventional science. She had contacted Dr. Martin Brenner. Chapter 4. Hawkins National Laboratory becoming number one. Dr. Martin Brenner was a man who saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. When he learned about the Creel House murders and the strange circumstances surrounding them, when he read Virginia Creel's desperate letters describing her son's impossible abilities, he didn't see a troubled family or a horrible crime. He saw potential. Raw, untapped potential that could revolutionize humanity's understanding of consciousness, of reality itself. If Henry Creel could truly do what Virginia claimed, if he genuinely possessed psychokinetic and telepathic abilities, then he represented the most significant scientific discovery in human history. After the murders, while Victor Creel was being processed through the legal system and Henry was recovering in the hospital, Brenner made his move. He had connections throughout the government, tentacles that reached into various agencies and departments. Project MKUltra was already underway, the CIA's controversial program to develop mind control techniques and enhance human consciousness through experimental drugs and psychological manipulation. Brenner had been involved with MKUltra since its inception, but he had always believed the program's methods were too crude, too indirect. They were trying to create psychic abilities through chemicals and conditioning when what they needed was someone who already possessed those abilities naturally, someone like Henry Creel. It wasn't difficult for Brenner to arrange Henry's transfer from the hospital to Hawkins National Laboratory. The boy was a minor, his father was incarcerated and deemed insane, and there were no other relatives to object. Official documents were forged, records were altered, and Henry Creel simply disappeared from the public record. As far as the world was concerned, the surviving Creel child had been taken into protective custody and sent to live with a distant relative. In reality, he had become a test subject, the first in what Brenner hoped would become a long line of enhanced individuals. Project Indigo, a sub-program of MKUltra specifically designed to replicate and weaponize psychic abilities. And Henry was designated as number 1, tattooed with that simple numeral on his forearm to mark his place in Brenner's grand experiment. The relationship between Brenner and Henry was complex from the beginning, a twisted dance between scientist and subject, captor and prisoner, father figure and object of study. Brenner genuinely believed he was doing important work, that the potential benefits of unlocking human consciousness justified whatever methods he employed. He saw Henry not as a troubled child who needed help, but as a miracle of nature that needed to be understood, controlled, and ultimately replicated. And Henry? Henry quickly learned to hate Brenner with an intensity that rivaled his contempt for humanity in general. Because Brenner was afraid of him. That much became clear almost immediately. Despite his scientific fascination with Henry's abilities, Brenner recognized the fundamental danger this boy represented. Henry was more powerful than anyone anticipated, his control over his abilities nearly perfect, his reach extending farther than any theoretical model suggested should be possible. More than that, there was something wrong with Henry on a fundamental level. Brenner could see it in the boy's eyes, in the way he looked at other people with cold assessment rather than empathy. This wasn't just a gifted child. This was something else, something that had perhaps never been entirely human even before the abilities manifested. So Brenner took precautions. He developed a device called Soteria, a small technological marvel that could be implanted directly into a subject's nervous system. Soteria had 2 functions. It suppressed psychic abilities to manageable levels, preventing the subject from accessing their full power, and it tracked the subject's location at all times. The implantation procedure was conducted without anesthetic, a brutal introduction to Henry's new life as a permanent resident of Hawkins Lab. When the Soteria chip was activated, Henry felt his abilities dim to a fraction of their previous intensity. It was like having his senses dulled, like experiencing the world through thick glass. He could still access his powers to some degree, enough that Brenner could continue studying him, but the overwhelming strength that had allowed him to murder his family was locked away behind the electronic barrier. Thus began years of captivity. Henry was officially designated as an orderly, someone who helped maintain the laboratory and assist with various tasks, but in reality he was a prisoner. The Soteria chip ensured he could never escape, and Brenner's control over every aspect of his existence meant that resistance was futile. Henry was studied endlessly, subjected to tests designed to understand the nature and limits of his abilities. Blood samples, tissue samples, endless monitoring of his brain activity and neurological functions. Brenner was obsessed with figuring out how to replicate what Henry could do, to create other individuals with similar abilities that could be controlled and weaponized. The other orderlies at the lab treated Henry with a mixture of fear and contempt, following Brenner's orders to occasionally torture him as a reminder of his place in the hierarchy. These sessions were presented as necessary discipline, ways to keep a dangerous subject intimidated and compliant. In reality, they were manifestations of fear. Everyone who worked at Hawkins Lab, from Brenner on down, understood on some level that Henry Creel was the most dangerous person in the building. Even with his abilities suppressed, even under constant surveillance, he remained a predator pretending to be domesticated. And predators, even caged ones, are always looking for an opportunity. Project Indigo moved forward despite the obstacle of not fully understanding Henry's abilities. Brenner decided that if he couldn't figure out the mechanism by which Henry's powers worked, he would simply introduce Henry's biological material into other subjects and see what happened. It was crude methodology, but Brenner had never been particularly concerned with ethical considerations. He recruited women to participate in what they were told were consciousness expansion experiments, or volunteers who believed they were contributing to important scientific research. These women were given experimental drugs, placed in sensory deprivation tanks, and injected with Henry Creel's blood. Then their babies were taken. Brenner didn't wait for the children to be born naturally. He had them removed from their mothers while still in the womb, brought into the world through forced extraction, and immediately separated from any family connection. The mothers were told various lies, that their children had died during the procedure, that there had been complications, that it was for the best. In reality, their babies were being raised in the laboratory itself, designated by numbers and monitored from birth to see if Henry's abilities had been successfully transferred through bloodline. And it worked, after a fashion. Not every child developed abilities, and those who did showed varying levels of power and control. But enough of them displayed genuine psychokinetic or telepathic gifts to prove the concept. Brenner's forced breeding program created a new generation of enhanced children, each tattooed with their subject number, each raised to think of Brenner as Papa, each unaware that they were manufactured weapons rather than beloved children. By the late 1970s, Hawkins Lab housed close to 20 of these children, ranging in age from very young to early teens, all living in the sterile white confines of the Rainbow Room, where Brenner could observe and test them. Henry, still designated as number 1, though no longer the only numbered subject, was given new responsibilities. He became a caretaker of sorts for the other children, an orderly who helped manage the younger subjects and assist with their training. Brenner likely thought this was a safe assignment, that with his Soteria implant limiting his abilities and the constant surveillance ensuring he couldn't act without being noticed, Henry could be useful in this capacity. What Brenner failed to account for was Henry's patience, his ability to plan long-term, and his skill at manipulation, because Henry had a gift beyond his psychic abilities. He understood people, understood how to read them, how to find their weaknesses and exploit them. And he had years to study the children of Hawkins Lab, to learn their fears and hopes, to identify which ones might be useful to his eventual plan of escape. Chapter 5. The Rainbow Room, Meeting 11. Among all the children raised in Hawkins' laboratory, among all the numbered subjects that Brenner's experimental program created, one stood out as truly exceptional, number 11. Her designation wasn't a reflection of her birth order among the test subjects, but rather her placement in the numerical sequence as they were brought into the program. By the time the 1970s reached their conclusion, 11 had proven herself to be the most powerful of all Brenner's manufactured psychics, with abilities that in some ways rivaled even what Henry could do with his Soteria implant, suppressing his full strength. But power meant little in the hierarchical hell of Hawkins' Lab if you didn't know how to wield it, and 11, born as Jane Ives before she was stolen from her mother and raised in institutional sterility, was at a disadvantage compared to the other children. She had spent time away from the lab in her earliest years, maintaining a connection to her mother Terry that the other children never had. This meant she hadn't been indoctrinated from birth into Brenner's cult of personality the way the others had. She questioned things more, resisted more, struggled with the demands placed upon her. This made her fascinating to Brenner, who saw in 11 the potential for something even greater than raw power, the possibility of creating a psychic weapon that could think independently while still serving the program's goals. It also made 11 a target. The other children, conditioned to see each other as rivals rather than siblings, to compete for Papa Brenner's approval rather than support each other, sensed 11's difference and responded with cruelty. The worst of them was number 2, the oldest and previously most powerful of the test subjects before 11 came along. 2 had grown arrogant during his time at the top of the hierarchy, and he deeply resented this newcomer who threatened his position. He bullied 11 relentlessly, using both his position among the other children and his own significant psychokinetic abilities to make her life miserable. Brenner allowed this dynamic to continue, perhaps even encouraged it. He believed competition among the subjects would make them stronger, would push them to develop their abilities more quickly. The fact that this competition took the form of psychological torture didn't concern him. These children weren't being raised to be happy or well-adjusted. They were being raised to be weapons, and weapons needed to be hardened through adversity. When 2's bullying became too obvious or violent, Brenner would intervene with punishment, but these interventions were infrequent enough that 2 and the others learned they could get away with quite a lot before Papa would actually step in. This was the environment in which Henry, still playing the role of Peter Ballard, the gentle orderly, began to establish a connection with young 11. He approached her carefully, recognizing that she was fundamentally different from the other children, not just in power level, but in her capacity for independent thought. Where the others had been successfully indoctrinated into seeing Brenner as a benevolent father figure, despite the abuse they endured, 11 maintained a spark of rebellion. She hated the tests, hated the sterile white rooms, hated the isolation from anything resembling normal human connection. Henry saw in this hatred an opportunity. He began speaking with 11 during moments when they were alone, or when surveillance was less intense. He presented himself as an ally, someone who understood her struggles, because he too had once felt out of place and misunderstood. He told her carefully curated half-truths about his own past, about feeling different from everyone else, about being seen as broken when in reality he was simply evolved beyond what others could comprehend. He never mentioned the murders, never revealed his true nature, but he planted seeds. Seeds of doubt about Brenner's motives. Seeds of anger towards the other children who tormented her. Seeds of the idea that she was special, not because Brenner said so, but because she genuinely transcended the limitations that bound weaker individuals. Henry shared with 11 his philosophy about humanity. He explained how people created artificial structures to make themselves feel safe and important, when in reality they were just frightened. Animals trying to deny their own insignificance. Time, laws, social hierarchies, morality itself, all inventions designed to impose order on a universe that had no inherent order. He told her about predators and prey, about how nature didn't care about human concepts of right and wrong, about how the strong taking what they wanted from the weak was simply the way reality functioned. And he suggested, carefully and subtly, that she and he were predators among prey, wolves who had been caged by sheep, who feared what they couldn't control. Some of what Henry told 11 was genuinely insightful. The observations of someone who had spent years thinking deeply about the nature of consciousness and society. Some of it was the philosophy of a psychopath trying to justify his own lack of empathy. 11, young and isolated, and desperate for anyone who seemed to understand her, absorbed it all without fully comprehending the danger in Henry's words. She began to see him as the one person in Hawkins Lab who treated her like a human being, rather than a test subject or a rival to be defeated. The other children noticed this growing connection and resented it. 2 especially took offence at seeing Peter Ballard pay special attention to 11, interpreting it as favouritism that elevated his rival even further. The bullying intensified, becoming more vicious and targeted. 2 would organise the other children to exclude 11 from their games, to mock her failures during training sessions, to make her feel as isolated as possible. During one particularly brutal competition that Brenner organised, where all the children competed to see who could use telekinesis most effectively in what was essentially gladiatorial combat, 2 went out of his way to humiliate 11 in front of everyone. Brenner responded to 2's behaviour by punishing him, but the punishment was mild compared to the offence. A few hours locked in a dark room, a temporary withdrawal of privileges, nothing that would genuinely deter 2 or make him reconsider his actions. Henry watched all of this with cold calculation, understanding that Brenner's half-hearted discipline was actually part of his methodology. The doctor wanted the children to be ruthless, wanted them to see each other as obstacles rather than allies. But he also wanted them to fear his authority enough to remain controllable. It was a delicate balance, and Henry could see the cracks in Brenner's system starting to show. While all of this was happening, while Henry was slowly manipulating 11 and observing the dynamics between the other children, he was also making his own plans. Years of captivity had given him plenty of time to think, to strategize, to prepare for the moment when he could finally escape the prison Brenner had constructed around him. The Soteria implant remained the primary obstacle. With his abilities suppressed, Henry couldn't simply overpower the guards or telekinetically remove the device himself. He needed help, and more specifically, he needed someone with psychokinetic abilities strong enough to remove the implant who would actually be willing to help him. Someone like 11. The manipulation became more targeted. Henry began suggesting to 11 that she was being held back, that Brenner's tests were designed not to help her grow stronger, but to keep her under control. He implied that the other children were collaborating with Brenner to suppress her, that they feared what she might become if she reached her full potential. He told her that there was a way out of this place, a way to freedom, but it required trust and courage. And slowly, methodically, he positioned himself as the only person who could guide her to that freedom. Other children in the lab included number 3, who possessed mental manipulation abilities that allowed him to influence thoughts. Number 6, who demonstrated precognitive gifts that let him glimpse possible futures and number 9, whose power allowed her to generate heat and potentially ignite objects through concentration. Each had their own personality, their own place in the hierarchy, their own relationship with Brenner and the other staff. But Henry's focus remained primarily on 11, because she was the key to everything. She was powerful enough to remove the Soteria implant, young enough to be manipulated, and just independent-minded enough to be convinced to act against Brenner's interests, if properly motivated. The Rainbow Room itself was a study in institutional cruelty disguised as childcare. Painted in bright colours with toys scattered about, it was designed to look like a space for children to play and develop normally. But the constant surveillance, the lack of privacy, the clinical atmosphere that underlay everything, created an environment where these enhanced children grew up warped and damaged. They learned to perform for Brenner, to demonstrate their abilities in measured doses that would please Papa without threatening him. They learned to hide their true feelings behind masks of compliance. They learned that love was conditional on usefulness, that care had to be earned through successful performance in tests, that relationships were tools to be weaponized rather than sources of genuine connection. And Henry watched it all, storing away information, waiting for the right moment to strike. Chapter 6. September 8th, 1979. The Massacre. The date would be seared into the history of Hawkins National Laboratory forever. September 8th, 1979. The day the facility's darkest secrets were revealed, the day Dr. Brenner's carefully controlled experiment collapsed into chaos and horror. The day when 16 of the 17 remaining test subjects died in circumstances so brutal that even the hardened military personnel who saw the aftermath were left shaken. This was the day Henry Creel finally escaped his cage, and the price of that escape was measured in the blood of children. The chain of events that led to the massacre began simply enough. Henry, through weeks of careful manipulation, had finally convinced 11 to help him. He had shown her the Soteria implant embedded in his neck, explaining that this device was what kept him trapped in the lab, what prevented him from helping her escape like he desperately wanted to. If she could remove it using her telekinetic abilities, he told her, they could both be free. He made it sound like salvation, like liberation, like the answer to all her prayers. He never mentioned what would happen once his full abilities were restored, never hinted at what he truly was, or what he intended to do. 11, isolated and desperate, and trusting one of the few people who had ever shown her kindness, agreed to help. They found a moment when surveillance was less intense, a window of opportunity in the facility's security protocol. 11 focused her abilities on the implant, using her psychokinetic power to carefully extract the Soteria device from Henry's neck. It was delicate work, requiring intense concentration, but 11 had grown strong enough to manage it. The device came free, pulling loose from nerve tissue and falling into Henry's palm. And in that instant, everything changed. The sensation of his full abilities returning must have been intoxicating. For years, Henry had existed in a diminished state, his powers dampened to a fraction of their true potential. Now, suddenly, that barrier was gone. He could feel his consciousness expanding, his reach extending throughout the facility and beyond, his capabilities returning to their full and terrible strength. He looked at 11 with an expression she didn't immediately understand, a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something cold. Henry told 11 to wait for him in a closet, that he would return for her shortly, that he just needed to take care of a few things first. She obeyed, still trusting, still believing that he was about to help her escape. Instead, Henry made his way to the Rainbow Room where most of the other children were gathered. He found the guards first, the men tasked with maintaining security in this section of the facility. They never had a chance. Henry's restored abilities allowed him to kill with a thought, to snap necks and crush skulls without even raising his hand. Their deaths were quick, clinical, efficient. They were obstacles to be removed, nothing more. Then he turned his attention to the children. The ones who had tormented 11, yes, but also the ones who had simply existed in the system, who had never done anything to Henry personally except serve as subjects in Brenner's program. He killed them methodically, moving through the Rainbow Room like death itself. Number 2, the bully who had made Eleven's life miserable, tried to fight back using his own considerable telekinetic abilities. It made no difference. Henry was operating on a completely different level, his power so overwhelming that 2's resistance was nothing more than a brief delay. The massacre continued throughout the laboratory. Number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. All of them died within minutes of each other, their bodies left broken and scattered throughout the facility. Some had their bones shattered, their limbs twisted at impossible angles. Others had their skulls crushed with such force that their features became unrecognizable. A few were lifted into the air and held there, suspended by invisible force, while life slowly drained from their bodies. Henry showed no mercy, no hesitation, no sign that these were children he had lived alongside for years. They were simply obstacles to be eliminated, proof of his power, casualties in his war against humanity's attempts to cage him. Dr. Brenner, realizing something catastrophic was happening, tried to seal himself in a secure location. But Henry found him anyway, breaking through barriers both physical and electronic to confront the man who had held him prisoner for so long. They had a conversation, though the details remained known only to the two of them. Henry likely explained his philosophy, his contempt for Brenner's attempts to control something as fundamentally superior as himself. He probably described his plans for humanity, his intention to remake reality according to his own vision. And Brenner, for perhaps the first time in his life, faced something he couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't reduce to data and analysis. Yet Henry chose not to kill Brenner. This decision would have far-reaching consequences that Henry couldn't anticipate in that moment. Perhaps he wanted Brenner to live with the knowledge of how completely his experiment had failed. Perhaps he recognized that Brenner's death would trigger additional security protocols that would make escape more difficult. Or perhaps, in some twisted way, Henry still saw Brenner as a father figure and found himself unable to commit complete patricide. Whatever the reason, Brenner survived the massacre, though he would bear the psychological scars of it for the rest of his life. 11 emerged from the closet to find carnage. Bodies everywhere, blood on the walls and floors, the sterile white facility transformed into an abattoir. She saw Henry standing in the centre of it all, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, completely at ease with the horror he had created. And she saw the truth of him for the first time. This wasn't the gentle orderly who had shown her kindness. This was something else entirely. Something monstrous wearing a human skin. The philosophy he had shared with her, which had seemed profound and insightful when delivered in quiet conversations, now revealed itself as the justification of a psychopath who saw murder as simply the natural order asserting itself. Henry tried to explain. He told 11 that he had freed them both, that this was necessary, that the other children were keeping them from achieving their true potential. He extended his hand to her, inviting her to join him, to become his companion in remaking the world. He painted a picture of the future he envisioned, a world without the artificial constraints humans imposed on reality, where beings like them could exist as the apex predators they were meant to be, where the weak would serve or be eliminated, and the strong would rule according to nature's only true law. 11's response was visceral horror. Whatever influence Henry had gained over her, through his manipulations, shattered in the face of what he had done. These were children, however troubled or cruel some of them had been, and he had slaughtered them without hesitation or remorse. She saw in his eyes no hint of humanity, no suggestion that he understood the magnitude of what he had done, and she recognized, perhaps for the first time, that power without conscience was the most dangerous thing in the world. A battle erupted between them, psychic abilities clashing in ways that tore at the fabric of reality itself. Henry was more experienced, more powerful in raw terms, his abilities honed through years of practice and recently restored to full strength. But 11 had something he didn't, a connection to memory, to love, to humanity that anchored her in ways Henry could no longer understand. She thought of her mother Terry, of the faint memories she had of being loved, of the possibility of a life beyond these white walls. And that connection gave her strength. The fight raged through the laboratory, two impossibly powerful psychics pushing their abilities to the absolute limit. Walls cracked. Equipment exploded. The very air seemed to shimmer with the force of their confrontation. Henry threw everything he had at 11, trying to break through her defences, trying to kill her or dominate her into submission. But 11 held firm, drawing on reserves of power she hadn't known she possessed, fueled by righteous anger at what Henry had done and determination that he would not be allowed to hurt anyone else. And then, in a moment that would echo through the rest of the series, 11 did something that neither she nor Henry anticipated. She didn't just push him back or knock him unconscious. She opened a rift in reality itself, a tear in the dimensional fabric that separated the normal world from other realms. Perhaps she was trying to banish him somewhere he could never return from. Or perhaps this was simply what happened when a psychic of her power level was pushed to her absolute limit. Either way, the result was the same. Henry Creel was ripped from Hawkins' laboratory and hurled into another dimension entirely, vanishing through a jagged wound in space that closed behind him almost as quickly as it opened. 11 collapsed, the effort of what she had done draining her completely. She fell into a coma that would last for some time, her mind needing to rebuild itself after being pushed so far beyond normal limits. When she eventually awoke, she would have no memory of these events, no recollection of Henry or the massacre, or what she had done to stop him. Her traumatized psyche had buried the memories so deeply that it would take years and external intervention to bring them back to the surface. Brenner, the only other person who knew the full truth, chose to raise 11 in total isolation after this incident, terrified of what might happen if he tried to recreate the conditions that had led to Henry's existence. The official story, the one reported to the military oversight committees that funded Hawkins Lab, was that there had been a catastrophic containment failure involving one of the subjects. The details were classified at the highest levels, and everyone involved was made to understand that discussing what happened would result in immediate and severe consequences. The bodies of the children were quietly disposed of, their deaths never officially recorded, their existence as test subjects erased from public record. As far as the world knew, the Hawkins Lab disaster was just another in a long line of Cold War experiments that went wrong. The details forever sealed behind walls of government secrecy. But Henry Creel wasn't dead. He had been sent somewhere far worse than death, thrown into a realm that would transform him from a psychopathic teenager into something far more terrible. The monster known as Vecna was about to be born. Chapter 7. Banishment, the journey through dimensions. The sensation of being ripped from one dimension and thrust into another is beyond any normal frame of reference. Imagine falling while simultaneously being pulled in every direction at once. Imagine your consciousness stretched across impossible distances while your body is compressed into something smaller than an atom. Imagine experiencing every moment of time simultaneously while also existing outside of time's flow entirely. This was what Henry Creel experienced as Eleven's desperate psychokinetic assault tore open a hole in reality and sent him tumbling through it. He fell for what felt like hours, though time had no meaning in the space between dimensions. The void through which he travelled was neither dark nor light, neither hot nor cold, but rather the complete absence of any sensory input that human consciousness could process. If Henry had been an ordinary person, this journey likely would have shattered his mind irreparably. But Henry was far from ordinary, and his psychic abilities allowed him to maintain some coherent sense of self, even as he plummeted through impossible space. Eventually, inevitably, he emerged somewhere. The transition was violent, Henry's body suddenly subjected to gravity and physics again, after existing in a realm where such things held no meaning. He crashed into hard ground that cracked beneath the impact, his form already beginning to change from the energies he had been exposed to during transit. As he struggled to his feet, trying to understand where 11 had sent him, he realized he was no longer in the world he knew. The realm Henry found himself in was desolate beyond anything he could have imagined. It was a wasteland of twisted rock formations and floating debris, a place where the sky crackled with energy that resembled lightning but wasn't quite the same as earthly electricity. The air, if it could be called air, carried a charge that made his skin prickle even as it was starting to burn. There was no sun, yet somehow the landscape was illuminated by a dim, reddish light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Spores or particles of some kind drifted through the atmosphere like diseased snow, and when Henry breathed them in, they tasted of rot and decay. This wasn't the Upside Down, not yet. The realm Henry had been banished to was something else, something that would later be referred to as Dimension X, or simply as the place before. It was a primordial space, a realm that existed parallel to Earth, but completely untouched by human influence. No buildings, no roads, no evidence that anything resembling civilization had ever existed here. Just endless expanses of alien landscape populated by creatures that bore only superficial resemblance to earthly life. Henry's body had been damaged during the journey. The energies he passed through, the violence of his passage between worlds, had begun a transformation that would only accelerate during his time in this place. His skin was burned, large sections of it blackened and cracking like overcooked meat. The lightning-like energy that permeated this dimension struck him repeatedly during those first hours, each bolt searing through him and leaving more damage, more transformation. Where the energy touched, his flesh didn't just burn, it fundamentally changed, becoming something other than human tissue. But even as his body was being destroyed and rebuilt, Henry's mind remained active. In fact, freed from the distractions of his human form's physical needs, his consciousness seemed to expand. His psychic abilities, already formidable, began to grow exponentially in this place. There was something about this dimension that enhanced psychic phenomena, that allowed consciousness to reach farther and touch more than should have been possible. Henry could feel his awareness stretching out across vast distances, could sense other presences in this realm, even though he saw nothing but desolate landscape. Pain racked his body constantly during this period. The transformation was not gentle or quick. His skin continued to burn and peel, revealing raw tissue beneath that was no longer quite human. His left hand began to elongate grotesquely, fingers stretching and hardening into something resembling talons. His face underwent the worst changes. features distorting as the flesh fell away to expose muscle and bone. His eyes, those windows to a soul that had never held much humanity to begin with, began to cloud over and change colour, becoming pale and misty. The nose he had been born with simply dissolved, leaving a gaping void in the centre of his face. Through it all, Henry endured. Perhaps this was the ultimate test of his will, the universe itself trying to break him and failing. He had survived his family, survived Brenner, survived Eleven's attempt to destroy him. He would survive this too, and he would emerge from it stronger than ever. The pain became background noise, something his mind could categorize and set aside while he focused on understanding this new realm and finding a way to use it to his advantage. As the transformation continued, and Henry began exploring his new environment, he encountered the creatures that called this dimension home. Demogorgons, though they wouldn't receive that name until much later, wandered the landscape like predators searching for prey. They were horrible things, vaguely humanoid in shape, but with flower-like heads that opened to reveal concentric rings of teeth. Despite their monstrous appearance, Henry felt a strange kinship with them. They were pure predators, creatures that existed solely to hunt and consume, untroubled by morality or conscience. In many ways, they were what Henry had always believed he truly was beneath his human veneer. Time passed strangely in this place. Days, weeks, months. Henry couldn't be sure how long he wandered through the desolate landscape. His body continued to change, becoming less human with each passing moment, but his mind remained sharp. He was adapting to this realm, learning its rules, understanding how to exist in a space that operated according to different physical and metaphysical laws than Earth. And slowly, methodically, he was formulating a plan. Because Henry had realized something crucial during his explorations. This dimension was not empty of consciousness. There was something here, something vast and old and powerful. He couldn't see it directly at first, could only sense its presence the way one might sense being watched in a dark room. But as his psychic abilities continued to expand in this place, as he became more attuned to the subtle energies that permeated Dimension X, he began to perceive what had been invisible before. Particles. Countless billions of them, perhaps more, each one impossibly small, but collectively forming something enormous. They swirled and moved through the air in patterns that suggested intelligence, or at least purposefulness. When Henry focused his enhanced abilities on these particles, he could feel them respond to his consciousness, could sense a vast mind, or perhaps many minds working in concert. This was the presence he had felt watching him, the entity that had been observing his transformation with interest. The Mind Flayer, though it had no name yet, had found a potential host. Chapter 8. The Mind Flayer, Shaping the Predator. The swirling mass of particles that Henry encountered in Dimension X was unlike anything he had experienced before, and Henry had experienced things that would drive most people to madness. First, he couldn't determine if what he was looking at was a single entity, or some kind of collective consciousness formed from billions of individual components. The particles moved with purpose, yes, but was that purpose guided by one intelligence or many? Did it matter? The important thing was that this presence, this entity, represented something Henry had been searching for his entire life without fully realizing it. Pure power unconstrained by human weakness. Henry approached the particle cloud cautiously at first, unsure if it represented a threat or an opportunity. His psychic abilities allowed him to touch its consciousness, to probe at its nature without directly engaging. What he discovered fascinated him. The entity, if it was an entity, seemed to be waiting. Not waiting for Henry specifically, but waiting for something or someone that could give it form, purpose, direction. It was potential energy looking for a catalyst, raw power seeking a will to guide it. In those early interactions, before Henry fully understood what he was dealing with, the relationship between predator and prey, between shaper and shaped, remained somewhat unclear. The particle mass responded to his psychic probes, yes, but it also seemed to be probing back, examining Henry's mind and finding something it recognised. Something compatible. Whether this swirling mass had been sentient before Henry encountered it, or whether Henry's consciousness gave it the semblance of intelligence, is a question Season 4 leaves partially open. What we see in Henry's monologue is him describing finding these particles and using them to transcend his human form, shaping them into the spider-like entity based on his childhood drawings. Whether he created the Mind Flayer from nothing, or simply moulded pre-existing dark matter into a specific form, the result was functionally the same, a vast entity under his complete control. Some interpretations, particularly those drawn from the stage play The First Shadow, suggest a longer connection between Henry and these dark forces, potentially dating back to his childhood. The show depicts the Mind Flayer as having influenced Henry even before his time in this dimension. However, what's explicitly shown in Season 4 is Henry discovering the particle cloud, recognising its potential, and deliberately shaping it into the Mind Flayer form we recognise from earlier seasons. Now they were together in a realm far removed from human interference, and whatever the nature of their connection before this moment, it was about to deepen significantly. Henry remembered his childhood fascination with black widow spiders. He remembered the drawings he had made, sketches of massive arachnid predators that combined elegance and lethality in perfect proportion. Those drawings had been more than idle fantasy. They had been a vision, a template for what Henry believed the ultimate predator should look like. And now, with this mass of particles responding to his consciousness, with his psychic abilities allowing him to manipulate matter at a fundamental level, Henry had the opportunity to make that vision real. He began to shape the particles. It was delicate work, requiring a level of concentration and control that would have been impossible before his transformation. But Henry's abilities had grown exponentially during his time in this dimension, enhanced by the very energies that were destroying his human form. He reached out with his mind and touched each particle, billions upon billions of them, giving them purpose and form. He organised them into structures, created hierarchy and architecture within the swirling mass, transformed chaos into terrible order. The shape that emerged was magnificent and horrible in equal measure. Henry built a massive form that stretched impossibly high into the strange sky of this dimension. A creature so large that it dwarfed mountains, so powerful that reality itself seemed to bend around it. The body was vaguely spider-like, with numerous appendages that branched and divided into smaller tentacles. The head, if it could be called a head, was elongated and flame-shaped, reminiscent of both the spiders Henry loved and something more primal, more fundamental. This was the Mind Flayer, birthed from Henry's consciousness and given physical form through the manipulation of particles that existed between dimensions. But the Mind Flayer was more than just a body Henry had created. The process of shaping the particles had created a connection, a bond between Henry's consciousness and this vast entity. They were no longer separate beings, but something new, a hybrid intelligence that existed simultaneously as individual and collective. Henry could feel his mind stretching across impossible distances, could sense every particle that comprised the Mind Flayer's form as if they were extensions of his own body. And through this connection, he gained something he had always desired but never fully possessed, absolute control over other consciousness. The Mind Flayer gave Henry the ability to create a hive mind, to link other beings into a collective consciousness where his will was law. The Demogorgons wandering this dimension, the strange vine-like organisms that grew across the landscape, even the very particles that floated through the air, all of it could be brought under his dominion. Henry had complained for years about humanity's artificial hierarchies and power structures, but what he truly objected to was not the existence of hierarchy, but rather his place outside it. Now he could create his own hierarchy, one where he stood at the apex with all other life arranged beneath him in perfect servitude. He began systematically bringing this dimension under his control. The Demogorgons were first, their relatively simple consciousness easy for the Mind Flayer to dominate. One by one, they were absorbed into the hive mind, their individual identities subsumed into the collective, their actions directed by Henry's will. The vine creatures followed, spreading across the landscape like neural pathways in a massive brain, connecting different parts of this realm into a single unified system. Even the very geography of the place began to change under Henry's influence, transforming from a random wasteland into something more organised, more purposeful. This was when Henry truly became Vecna, though he wouldn't learn that name until much later, when the children of Hawkins compared him to a character from their role-playing games. The transformation was complete not just physically, his human body utterly destroyed and rebuilt into something monstrous, but psychologically as well. Whatever small threads of humanity had remained within Henry Creel after he murdered his family, after he slaughtered the children of Hawkins Lab, were now severed entirely. Vecna was something new, something that had never existed before. A human consciousness expanded to godlike proportions and utterly divorced from any vestige of empathy or moral constraint. For approximately 4 years, Vecna consolidated his power in this dimension. From the fall of 1979, when 11 banished him, until November of 1983 when the first gate opened, he built the hive mind, learned to manipulate the strange physics of this realm, and prepared for the moment when he could extend his reach back to Earth. He explored every corner of this dimension, claimed every creature for his growing army, shaped the very landscape to serve his purposes. The realm itself began to take on characteristics that reflected Vecna's consciousness, becoming darker, more oppressive, more hostile to anything that wasn't part of his hive mind. But even as he was building his power base in this dimension, Vecna never forgot about Earth, never stopped thinking about the world that had rejected him, the humanity he despised, the civilization he longed to see crumble into dust. He maintained his connection to Hawkins' laboratory through the residual psychic link he had with that place, watching from across dimensions as Dr. Brenner continued his experiments with 11. He observed as the Doctor, terrified of what had happened with Subject 1, raised 11 in isolation, training her abilities while keeping her completely cut off from other enhanced individuals. Vecna learned patience during these years. He understood that directly assaulting Earth from another dimension would be difficult, perhaps impossible, without a gate connecting the two realms. He needed someone on the other side to open a passage, to create a bridge he could cross, or at minimum a crack through which his influence could seep. And he recognized that 11, despite having banished him, might ultimately become the key to his return. She was powerful enough to tear holes in reality after all. If he could manipulate circumstances, could guide events toward a moment where 11 used her abilities to open a gate, then he could begin extending his influence back into the world he had been torn from. The waiting was easier now that he had an entire dimension to rule over. Vecna spent his time refining his control over the hive mind, experimenting with how far his consciousness could reach, testing the limits of what he could accomplish through the Mind Flayer. He discovered that time operated strangely in this dimension, that moments could stretch or compress in ways that defied normal causality. This temporal fluidity would later explain some of the strange aspects of the Upside Down, but for now, it simply meant that Vecna's years in exile felt both longer and shorter than they would have on Earth. And he waited, watching, planning, preparing for the day when a crack would appear, when someone would create an opening large enough for him to reach through, when he could finally begin the work of destroying the world that had tried to cage him. Vecna had transcended his human form, become the predator he always believed he was meant to be, and he would not rest until every last vestige of human civilization was ground into dust beneath his will. Chapter 9. The Upside Down, a Mirror of Hawkins. Everything changed on November 6th, 1983. This was the date when 11, under duress from Dr. Brenner's continued experiments, made psychic contact with a Demogorgon. The encounter terrified her. The alien consciousness of the creature invading her mind in ways that felt violating and wrong. In her panic, she reflexively lashed out with her abilities, and in doing so, tore open a massive gate between Earth and the dimension where Vecna had been waiting for years. The Mother Gate, as it would later be called, opened in the basement of Hawkins' laboratory, creating a permanent doorway between the normal world and the realm Vecna had claimed as his own. From Vecna's perspective, this was the moment he had been anticipating. Finally, after 4 years of exile, he had a way to reach back into Earth. The gate was more than just a physical opening. It created a psychic link between dimensions, allowed his consciousness to extend through, and touch things on the other side. And Vecna's first move was to create a hunting ground, a staging area from which he could operate while preparing his eventual return. The dimension began to change, though exactly when and why remains one of the mysteries the show hasn't fully explained. What we observe in the series is that the Upside Down appears as a decayed mirror of Hawkins, Indiana. Buildings stand in the same locations as their real-world counterparts, though covered in vines and corruption. Streets follow identical patterns. Most notably, the Upside Down seems to be frozen at a specific moment in time. November 6th, 1983, the day 11 opened the first gate. Nancy discovers this in Season 4, when she finds her diary entries in the Upside Down version of her room, with the last entry dated to that specific day. The prevailing theory, supported by this evidence, suggests that when 11 tore open the Mother Gate, the dimensional barrier didn't just create a doorway, it somehow caused the Upside Down to imprint itself on Hawkins, copying the town as it existed in that specific moment. Whether Vecna actively shaped this transformation, or whether it was an automatic result of the two dimensions connecting, remains unclear. What's certain is that from November 6th, 1983 onward, anyone entering the Upside Down would find a corrupted version of Hawkins frozen at that particular date, creating a snapshot that would remain unchanged even as years passed in the normal world. Why Vecna chose to shape his dimension into a copy of Hawkins is a matter of some speculation. Perhaps it was tactical, creating familiar ground that his Demogorgons could use to navigate when they crossed through gates. Perhaps it was psychological, a way for Vecna to maintain connection with the world he came from, and the town where he had been raised and imprisoned. Or perhaps it was something darker, a form of revenge that involved slowly corrupting and consuming the very place that represented his past. Whatever the reason, the result was undeniable. The Upside Down became a dark mirror of the normal world, similar enough to be recognizable but twisted enough to be deeply unsettling. The vine organisms that Vecna had brought under his control spread throughout this mirror, Hawkins, creating a network system that essentially turned the entire dimension into an extension of Vecna's consciousness. These vines served as neural pathways, conducting information and allowing Vecna to sense everything that happened anywhere in his domain. They could also serve as physical restraints, wrapping around prey and holding it helpless while Vecna consumed its consciousness and energy. The spores that filled the air in this place were particles of the Mind Flayer itself, broken into microscopic components that could infect and transform anything that breathed them in deeply enough or for long enough. With his connection to Earth re-established, Vecna began to execute his long-term plan. He couldn't cross through the gate himself. Not yet. His transformation had rendered him physically massive and tied to the dimension he ruled, like a spider at the centre of a web that extends far beyond its physical location, but from which the spider itself cannot stray far. But he could send his servants through. The Demogorgon that 11 had contacted became Vecna's first scout, sent through the Mother Gate to explore Hawkins proper and report back through their hive mind link. What followed was a series of events that would terrorise Hawkins for years to come, each incident orchestrated by Vecna, even though the people experiencing them had no idea who was actually pulling the strings. The Demogorgon's hunt for Will Byers, the young boy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and got dragged into the Upside Down, was Vecna using his creature to scout the area and identify potential vulnerabilities. The various attacks on people throughout that first season, the stalking and killing of Barbara Holland, the assault on Hawkins Lab itself, all of it was Vecna testing the boundaries of what his forces could accomplish while learning about the defences Earth could mount against his incursions. 11's eventual destruction of that Demogorgon was a setback, but not a crucial one. Vecna had other creatures, could send more through if needed, and more importantly, he was learning valuable information about 11's current capabilities. She was powerful, more powerful than she had been during their confrontation at the lab, but she was also emotionally driven and prone to exhausting herself when pushed too hard. These were weaknesses Vecna could exploit in future confrontations. The gate remained open after the first Demogorgon was killed, and Vecna continued working to expand his influence. He sent more creatures through during the following year, built his forces, and prepared for a more ambitious assault. This time, rather than relying on physically powerful but relatively simple-minded Demogorgons, Vecna decided to directly possess someone in Hawkins. He needed a host, someone whose body he could control remotely through the hive mind connection, someone who could move through normal society and prepare the way for a larger invasion. Will Byers, who had been exposed to the Upside Down and infected with Mind Flayer particles during his time there, became the perfect candidate. Vecna reached across dimensions and took control of the boy, using him as a spy and eventually as a living gateway through which more of his essence could flow. The possession of Will was sophisticated, allowing Vecna to see through the boy's eyes, access his memories, and use him to spread infection to others. It also gave Vecna insights into how humans thought and felt, information he could use to manipulate them more effectively. The campaign of that second year involved Vecna trying to establish a permanent foothold in Hawkins. He spread his vine network through the town's tunnel system, creating a literal underground extension of the Upside Down beneath people's feet. He infected various creatures, creating demodogs that could hunt in packs and coordinate their attacks with terrifying efficiency. And he worked toward his ultimate goal, widening the gate enough that he could bring through enough of his forces to overwhelm any resistance. But 11 and her allies stopped him again. Joyce Byers figured out how to free her son from Vecna's possession using elevated heat, which disrupted the Mind Flayer particles controlling Will. The gate was temporarily closed, cutting off Vecna's connection and forcing his creatures on Earth to retreat or die. It was another setback, another delay in his plans, but Vecna was patient. He had already waited years in that other dimension. He could wait longer if necessary. The following year brought a new strategy. If Vecna couldn't maintain a permanent gate, he would create a new avatar on Earth itself. He possessed Billy Hargrove, Max's stepbrother, and used him to spread the infection to others in Hawkins. The goal this time was to build a physical form for the Mind Flayer in the real world, a body made from the melted and reconstituted flesh of his victims. This biomass spider would allow Vecna to act directly in Hawkins, even without an open gate, to hunt down and kill 11 before she could interfere with his plans again. The avatar came close to succeeding. It nearly killed 11, biting her and injecting particles that began to poison her abilities and corrupt her from within. But Billy, in a moment of reclaimed humanity, chose to sacrifice himself to stop the creature, buying 11 and the others enough time to retreat. And Joyce Byers, with the help of Jim Hopper and Murray Bauman, managed to close the gate once again, this time by destroying the Russian facility that had been forcing it back open. Each of these setbacks taught Vecna something. He learned that direct confrontation, while satisfying, wasn't necessarily the most effective strategy. He learned that 11 had allies who would sacrifice themselves to protect her. He learned that gates could be closed if someone was brave enough or desperate enough to do so. And most importantly, he learned that he needed a different approach, one that didn't rely on maintaining an open gate or building a vulnerable avatar in the real world. So Vecna bided his time. He retreated into the Upside Down, into the mirror version of the Creel House, where he maintained his physical form, and he began developing a new strategy. One that would take advantage of his enhanced telepathic abilities, his understanding of human psychology, and his capacity for inflicting psychological torture. He would no longer try to invade Hawkins with armies of creatures. Instead, he would open gates from the other side, using the deaths of carefully selected victims as keys to tear holes between dimensions. Chapter 10. The Creel House Connection. The upside-down version of the Creel House held special significance for Vecna. While the entire mirror dimension was technically his domain, subject to his will and connected to his consciousness through the vast vine network that spread everywhere, the house on Moorhead Street was different. This was where he maintained his physical form, where the grotesque thing he had become resided like a spider in the centre of its web. The house was both prison and throne, a place that tied him to his past while serving as the seat of his power in this dimension. The architecture of the upside-down Creel House matched its real-world counterpart perfectly, frozen as it was on the day 11 opened the first gate. Every room, every hallway, every piece of furniture existed in the same position it had occupied in 1983. But corruption had seeped into every surface. The walls were covered in the fleshy vine material that characterized all of Vecna's domain, pulsing with the slow rhythm of a vast heartbeat. The air was thick with spores, creating an atmosphere that was both claustrophobic and nauseating. The grandfather clock, that symbol of time and order that young Henry Creel had both hated and been fascinated by, still stood in the hallway, though now it served as a marker for those Vecna had chosen to kill. Vecna's physical form within the house was grotesque even by the standards of the creatures that inhabited the Upside Down. His body was enveloped by the vines, suspended in a network of organic tendrils that connected him to every part of his domain. His flesh, what remained of it, was a patchwork of human skin, and something else. Something that had replaced his original tissue during the years of transformation. His face was a horror show, features barely recognizable as having once been human, dominated by those pale, clouded eyes that seemed to see everything despite looking dead. And his hand, his elongated left hand, with its terrible talons, hung at his side, ready to reach out and tear apart anything that came within range. But despite the horror of his appearance, despite the years spent in another dimension and the complete loss of his humanity. Vecna still maintained certain memories and connections to his past life as Henry Creel. The Creel House was where he had killed his mother and sister, where he had first fully embraced what he was. It held significance not because he felt guilt or remorse. Vecna was incapable of such emotions, but because it represented a formative moment in his development. This was where the last pretense of humanity had been stripped away, where Henry Creel had proven to himself that he was above moral constraint. The house also served a practical purpose in Vecna's plans. When he eventually developed the ability to reach across dimensions and possess people remotely, to invade their minds and kill them from a distance, he needed a nexus point from which to operate. The Creel House, with its heavy concentration of vines and its position as the place where Vecna's physical form resided, provided the perfect location. He could sit here, surrounded by the organic machinery of the hive mind, and extend his consciousness across dimensional boundaries to touch victims in the real world. The grandfather clock became a crucial element in Vecna's killing methodology. He used it as a psychological weapon, projecting visions of the clock to his chosen victims as a warning that their time was running out. The symbolism was perfect. Henry Creel had always despised humanity's obsession with measuring time, with dividing existence into rigid segments and trying to control the uncontrollable through the creation of schedules and deadlines. Now, as Vecna, he could use that very symbol of temporal order as an instrument of death, showing his victims a clock that counted down the hours and minutes remaining in their lives. When someone saw the grandfather clock, whether appearing in the walls of Hawkins High or materializing in front of them during a hallucination, it meant Vecna had marked them for death. The clock served as both threat and promise. Time, that thing humans cared so much about, was running out. And when the clock's hands reached their appointed position, Vecna would reach across dimensions and kill his victim, using their death to open a new gate between worlds. The visions Vecna sent to his victims in those final hours before he killed them were carefully crafted to maximize psychological damage. He didn't just randomly terrorize people. Instead, he dug into their memories, found their deepest traumas and most painful secrets, and forced them to relive those moments with enhanced intensity. He would show them their failures, their guilts, their shames, everything they tried to bury or forget. The goal was to break them down mentally before destroying them physically, to ensure they were in a state of absolute terror when he finally reached through and shattered their bodies. This psychological warfare was signature Vecna, a manifestation of the same twisted philosophy he had expressed years ago when he was still Henry Creel in Hawkins Lab. He believed that human civilization was built on lies, that people created comfortable illusions to hide from uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world. By forcing his victims to confront their darkest memories, by stripping away their defences and making them face reality without filters, Vecna thought he was showing them mercy of a sort. He was freeing them from their illusions, even if that freedom came with the price of death. The physical process of killing from a distance involved Vecna establishing a psychic link with his victim, pulling their consciousness into a mindscape that existed partially in the victim's thoughts and partially in the upside down. This red-misted realm, filled with fragments of the victim's memories rendered in nightmarish forms, became the arena where Vecna's final confrontation with each target took place. He would appear to them there, his monstrous form given shape within their mind, and speak to them about their failures and weaknesses before killing them. The deaths themselves were brutal. Vecna's psychokinetic abilities, already formidable when he was human, had been amplified by his fusion with the Mind Flayer. He could break bones with a thought, crush organs without touching them, twist bodies into impossible positions. His Victims' deaths served multiple purposes. They satisfied his sadistic enjoyment of human suffering. They demonstrated his superiority over those he killed. And crucially, they opened gates at the location where each victim died. This last element was key to Vecna's ultimate plan. Each death created a tear in the dimensional fabric, a wound that connected the Upside Down to Hawkins. Individually, these gates were relatively small and unstable, potentially easy to seal if someone understood what they were dealing with. But Vecna wasn't interested in opening just one or two gates. He wanted to open many, strategically positioned around Hawkins, so that the cumulative effect would be catastrophic. If he could open enough gates, position them correctly in a geometric pattern, then the boundaries between dimensions would collapse entirely. The Upside Down and the normal world would merge, creating a hellscape where Vecna could operate freely, and where humanity would have no defense against his power. Chapter 11. 1986. The Killing Spree. By 1986, Vecna had refined his abilities to the point where he could act with precision and purpose. He had learned from his previous failed attempts to invade Hawkins, understood that brute force approaches like sending demogorgons through gates or possessing people to build flesh avatars weren't sustainable. The people of Hawkins, or at least certain residents of Hawkins, had proven frustratingly resilient in fighting back against such direct threats. So Vecna adapted, developed a more subtle and ultimately more devastating approach. His plan was elegantly simple in concept, but complex in execution. He would identify victims in Hawkins who met certain criteria, specifically people dealing with trauma, guilt, or psychological damage that made them vulnerable to his telepathic intrusions. He would mark these people, giving them visions that would haunt them for days before he moved in for the kill. And when he finally struck, when he pulled them into his mindscape and broke their bodies, their deaths would serve as sacrifices to open gates between dimensions. 4 deaths, Vecna calculated, would be sufficient. 4 strategically positioned victims, their deaths creating 4 gates arranged in a geometric pattern, would generate enough dimensional instability to tear down the barriers entirely. The Upside Down would spill into Hawkins like poison seeping into healthy tissue, transforming the entire town into an extension of his domain. From there, the corruption would spread outward, slowly consuming more and more of Earth until the entire planet existed as part of Vecna's hive mind. The first victim was Chrissy Cunningham, a popular cheerleader at Hawkins High whose outward appearance of confidence and success masked deep insecurity and trauma. Vecna had been observing Hawkins remotely for some time, using his psychic abilities to probe the minds of various residents and identify those who would make suitable targets. Chrissy's struggles with her mother's emotional abuse and her own body image issues created the kind of psychological vulnerability Vecna needed. He began sending her visions days before he planned to kill her, showing her the clock, giving her nightmares that left her exhausted and terrified. When Vecna finally attacked Chrissy, she was at the trailer home of Eddie Munson, the town's resident metalhead and dealer of recreational substances. She had gone there looking for something to help her sleep, to quiet the visions that were driving her to the edge of breakdown. Instead, she found death. Vecna pulled her consciousness into his mindscape, showed her the darkest aspects of her relationship with her mother, and then killed her with such violence that her body was left broken and twisted, levitating briefly before collapsing to the floor. Eddie, who witnessed the event without understanding what had happened, was traumatized and instantly became the prime suspect in what appeared to be a ritualistic murder. The second victim was Fred Benson, a student journalist at Hawkins High who carried guilt over a car accident he had been involved in. Fred's trauma was different from Chrissy's, centered on a specific incident, where his actions had led to someone else's injury. Vecna exploited this guilt masterfully, sending Fred visions of the accident victim condemning him, making him relive that moment of failure over and over until his mental defences were completely shattered. Fred died on a deserted road, his body found broken and his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Max Mayfield was supposed to be the third victim, but she proved far more resilient than Vecna anticipated. Max had been dealing with guilt over the death of her stepbrother Billy, feeling responsible because part of her had wished him dead during the years he abused her, only to have those wishes granted in the most horrible way possible when Billy died fighting the Mind Flayer's avatar. Vecna saw this guilt as the perfect vulnerability to exploit, and he began tormenting Max with visions of Billy, showing her the moment of his death over and over, whispering that it was her fault he died. But Max had something many of Vecna's victims lacked: a support system of friends who understood what was happening and were willing to fight for her. When Vecna pulled Max into his mindscape for what should have been her final moments, her friends in the real world played her favourite song, providing an emotional anchor that allowed Max to break free from Vecna's control. She escaped his grasp, at least temporarily, forcing Vecna to look for another victim to maintain his schedule. Patrick McKinney became the third death, a basketball player whose trauma stemmed from his father's abuse. Patrick's death occurred at Lover's Lake, his body rising into the air and breaking apart in front of witnesses who couldn't understand what they were seeing. This death, like the others, opened a gate at the location where Patrick died, continuing Vecna's geometric pattern. By this point, the people of Hawkins who understood what was happening, primarily the group of teenagers who had been fighting threats from the Upside Down for years, had figured out Vecna's identity and his connection to the Creel House. Nancy Wheeler and Robin Buckley interviewed Victor Creel in the psychiatric facility where he had been imprisoned for decades, learning the truth about what had happened to his family. Steve Harrington, Dustin Henderson, Lucas Sinclair, and the others pieced together the connection between the murders and the gates, realizing that Vecna was trying to merge dimensions. A desperate plan was formed to stop Vecna before he could complete his ritual. Multiple groups would act simultaneously. Some would attack Vecna's physical form in the Upside Down, attempting to destroy or at least distract him, while others would protect Max in the real world, keeping her out of Vecna's reach and preventing him from completing his pattern of 4 deaths. It was a risky strategy that relied on coordination across dimensions and required several people to enter the Upside Down directly, knowing they might not return. The confrontation in the Upside Down Creel House was brutal. Nancy, Steve, Robin, and Eddie made their way through the mirror dimension to Vecna's lair, fighting past his Demobat servants and navigating the vine-filled corridors. When they found Vecna, suspended in his nest of vines and seemingly vulnerable, Nancy shot him repeatedly with a shotgun loaded with makeshift explosive rounds. The attack wounded Vecna, genuinely hurt him for perhaps the first time since his transformation, but it wasn't enough to kill him. His connection to the hive mind made him incredibly resilient, able to draw on the energy of his entire domain to sustain himself. While the physical assault was happening in the Upside Down, Vecna simultaneously attacked Max in the real world. He pulled her into his mindscape, suspending her body in the air at the graveyard near the abandoned Creel House as he prepared to break her. This would be his 4th victim, the final death needed to complete his plan. Max fought back, using memories of her friends and her life to resist Vecna's psychological assault, but she was weakening. Her body began to break, bones snapping, eyes bleeding, limbs twisting at unnatural angles. All the telltale signs that Vecna's psychokinetic grip was crushing the life out of her. 11 who had been regaining her powers after losing them at the end of the previous year, reached Max through the psychic void. She entered Vecna's mindscape and fought him directly, mind against mind, in a battle that raged across psychological space. The confrontation between them was a rematch years in the making, the two most powerful psychics in the world clashing in a realm where thought became reality. 11 was stronger than she had been during their first encounter, but Vecna had the advantage of experience and his connection to the Mind Flayer. The physical assault in the Upside Down and 11's psychic battle combined to overwhelm Vecna's defences. He was forced to divide his attention, to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously, and even his vast power had limits. The damage from Nancy's shotgun and Molotov cocktails, the distraction of 11's assault, and the strain of maintaining his hold on Max altogether proved too much. Vecna's body caught fire and fell from the attic of the Creel House in the Upside Down, seemingly defeated. In that moment, his grip on Max weakened enough for 11 to reach her. But the damage had already been done. Max's heart stopped. Her limbs had been broken, her eyes blinded, and clinically speaking, she died in Lucas's arms. 11, refusing to accept this outcome, used her abilities to reach into Max's fading consciousness and bring her back. Max's heart started beating again, but she remained in a coma, her mind seemingly trapped somewhere between life and death, unable to wake. Whether Max's brief death counted as Vecna's fourth sacrifice is a question with devastating implications. What undeniable is that 4 gates opened in Hawkins at that moment, arranged in a pattern that met at a central point downtown. The boundaries between dimensions cracked, then shattered. The Upside Down began spilling into Hawkins, creating a massive rift that tore through the centre of town. Buildings crumbled, the ground split apart, and corruption spread outward from the wound in reality. Vecna had achieved his goal, at least partially. The merge between dimensions had begun, and while it wasn't complete, while there were still barriers that prevented him from moving freely between worlds, he had taken a crucial step toward his ultimate objective of destroying human civilization and remaking reality according to his vision. The people of Hawkins, those who survived the initial catastrophe, found themselves living in a town that was slowly being consumed by another dimension. Strange phenomena began occurring with increasing frequency. The dead sections of town, the areas where gates had opened, became essentially uninhabitable as corruption spread outward from those wounds in reality. And somewhere in the Upside Down, wounded but very much alive, Vecna waited and planned his next move. Chapter 12. The Philosophy of a Monster. To truly understand Vecna, to comprehend the scope of his evil and the depth of his hatred for humanity, one must understand the philosophy that drove his actions. This wasn't a mindless monster, or a creature acting on instinct. Vecna possessed human-level intelligence, perhaps even superhuman intelligence given his psychic abilities and the way his consciousness had expanded through his connection with the Mind Flayer. Every action he took, every person he killed, served his larger worldview and his ultimate goal of remaking reality. At the core of Vecna's philosophy was a fundamental contempt for human civilization and the structures humans created to organize their existence. He saw time as an artificial imposition on the natural flow of reality, a construct humans invented to make sense of a universe that had no inherent order or meaning. The division of existence into past, present, and future, the measurement of duration in seconds and minutes and hours, all of it was false according to Vecna. Reality didn't care about humanity's clocks and calendars. These were comforting lies that allowed people to feel as though they had some control over the inevitable march toward death. Social hierarchies, moral codes, laws, customs, all the invisible rules that governed human behaviour were similarly artificial in Vecna's view. Humans created these structures out of fear, building cages around themselves to avoid confronting the fundamental truth of existence, that they were animals, prey animals at that, desperately pretending to be more significant than they actually were. The strong taking from the weak wasn't wrong or evil in Vecna's framework. It was simply nature asserting itself, reality expressing its only true law, which was that power determined everything. Vecna saw himself as having evolved beyond human limitations. His psychic abilities, which he believed had been latent within him since birth, rather than truly awakened by his experience in Dimension X, marked him as fundamentally superior to ordinary humans. He was a predator among prey, a spider among flies, something that existed on a higher plane of existence, and therefore couldn't be bound by the moral frameworks that governed lesser beings. When he killed people, he wasn't committing murder in any meaningful sense. He was simply doing what predators do, taking what he wanted from those too weak to resist. This worldview extended to his treatment of his family. Henry Creel didn't kill his mother and sister because they had done something specific to deserve death. He killed them because they represented everything he despised about humanity. His mother feared what he was, looked at him with suspicion and eventually horror, and Henry saw that fear as proof of humanity's fundamental weakness. She couldn't accept what he truly was, couldn't embrace the reality of power in its purest form, and so she had to be eliminated. His sister Alice was equally contemptible in Henry's eyes, vapid and shallow, content to exist within the confines of social propriety without ever questioning or looking deeper. Her cheerfulness in the face of life's essential meaninglessness disgusted him. The children at Hawkins Laboratory were somewhat different. Henry didn't hate them personally, at least not most of them. They were victims of Brenner's experimentation just as he was, children who had been stolen from their mothers and raised in captivity. But they were also keeping him imprisoned, through their very existence. As long as Brenner had other psychic subjects to study, as long as the program continued to produce results through these manufactured children, Henry's chance of escape was minimal. Killing them served the practical purpose of eliminating Brenner's ability to continue his research, but it also satisfied Henry's contempt for the manufactured nature of their abilities. They hadn't been born superior like he had. They were copies, crude imitations of what he naturally was, and he resented their existence on a fundamental level. As Vecna, this philosophy intensified and expanded. His fusion with the Mind Flayer, his transformation into something that was no longer even remotely human, allowed him to embrace his role as predator without any lingering conscience or doubt. He had become exactly what he always believed he should be, a creature of pure power and will, unconstrained by morality or empathy, capable of reshaping reality according to his desires. The hive mind he created was the perfect expression of his worldview, a system where the weak existed solely to serve the strong, where one consciousness dominated all others absolutely, where hierarchy was natural and eternal rather than artificial and changeable. Vecna's victims in 1986 were chosen not just for their vulnerability, but for what they represented. Chrissy Cunningham exemplified the lies people tell themselves and others, presenting a facade of confidence and success while hiding deep pain and insecurity. Fred Benson represented guilt and the human tendency to be paralyzed by past mistakes rather than simply moving forward. Patrick McKinney's abuse at his father's hands illustrated the cyclical nature of human violence and weakness. And Max Mayfield, the one who got away, embodied something Vecna particularly despised, the idea that love and connection could overcome trauma and provide strength. By forcing his victims to confront their darkest memories, by stripping away the comfortable lies they told themselves about their lives. Vecna believed he was showing them truth in its purest form. The fact that this truth came with the price of death was irrelevant to him. Humans were going to die anyway, their brief existences snuffed out by time and decay, regardless of what Vecna did or didn't do. He was simply accelerating the inevitable while making their final moments meaningful in a way their lives had never been. They would die knowing the truth about themselves, seeing through the illusions that had sustained them. Whether they wanted this revelation or not didn't matter. Vecna knew better than they did what they needed. The ultimate expression of Vecna's philosophy was his plan to merge dimensions and transform Earth into an extension of the Upside Down. This wasn't just about personal revenge against a world that had rejected him, though that was certainly part of it. Vecna genuinely believed he was performing a necessary correction, removing the artificial structures humans had built and returning reality to its natural state. A world under his control through the hive mind would be honest in a way human civilization never was. There would be no more lies, no more pretending that humans were special or significant, no more artificial morality constraining the exercise of power. Just predator and prey, strong and weak, with Vecna as the apex consciousness directing everything according to his will. He didn't expect gratitude for this transformation. Vecna understood that humans would resist, would fight desperately to preserve their illusions and their artificial civilization. But their resistance didn't make them right. It simply proved they were too weak and afraid to accept truth. And eventually, inevitably, that resistance would be crushed. Vecna had patience, had power beyond anything humanity could muster to oppose him. And most importantly, he had conviction. He knew he was right, knew his worldview represented reality as it actually existed rather than how humans wished it to be. This absolute certainty in his own righteousness made Vecna perhaps more dangerous than any mindless monster could be. A simple creature operating on instinct could be predicted, could be trapped or distracted or killed through conventional means. But Vecna was intelligent, strategic, and completely committed to his vision of remaking reality. He could plan long-term, could adapt to changing circumstances, could manipulate and deceive and wage psychological warfare. And he would never stop, never give up, never doubt that he was doing what needed to be done. This combination of power, intelligence, and absolute conviction in a philosophy that viewed human suffering as not just acceptable but necessary made him the perfect villain, the ultimate threat against which all others paled in comparison. The legacy of Henry Creel. The transformation of Henry Creel into Vecna represents one of the most complete and horrifying villain origin stories in modern fiction. Unlike monsters that simply exist without explanation, unlike evil that manifests fully formed, Vecna's evolution from troubled child to genocidal monster spans decades and crosses dimensional boundaries. Every step of his journey makes terrible sense when viewed through the lens of his philosophy and psychology. Nothing that happened to him forced him to become what he became. Rather, each experience revealed more of what he had always been, while providing him the means to express his true nature more fully. The tragedy, if such a word can be applied to a monster who showed no mercy or restraint, is that intervention at various points might have altered his trajectory. If his family had sought help when his abilities first manifested, instead of trying to ignore the problem and hoping a change of location would fix it, perhaps young Henry could have learned to control his gifts without sliding into psychopathy. If, Doctor, Brenner had approached Henry with genuine compassion rather than seeing him as a specimen to be studied and controlled, perhaps the years in Hawkins Lab would have been rehabilitation rather than imprisonment. If any of the adults in Henry's life had recognised the warning signs of a deeply disturbed child and taken appropriate action instead of dismissing his behaviour or responding with fear and cruelty, perhaps the murders would never have happened. But these are counterfactuals, alternate histories that exist only in imagination. The reality is that Henry Creel was what he was, whether by nature or a combination of nature and his experience in Dimension X as a child, or simply through a series of choices he made at key moments. And the reality is that no one successfully intervened, no one found the right approach to reach him, no one prevented his transformation from troubled boy to mass murderer to interdimensional horror. By the time 11 sent him into the Upside Down, Henry was already beyond redemption. The years he spent there simply completed a process that had been underway since childhood. The impact of Vecna on Stranger Things cannot be overstated. He is responsible, directly or indirectly, for virtually every terrible thing that has happened in Hawkins since Will Byers disappeared in 1983. The Demogorgon that took Will, the Mind Flayer that possessed him, the flesh avatar that killed Billy, all of it traces back to Vecna and his campaign to breach the dimensional barriers and corrupt Earth. Characters who died fighting these threats, people like Bob Newby and Billy Hargrove and others, are ultimately Vecna's victims, even though he never personally touched them. More than that, Vecna represents the existential threat that the protagonists of Stranger Things will need to overcome in the series' final season. Previous threats were dangerous but relatively straightforward. The Demogorgon was a predator that could be killed. The Mind Flayer's avatars could be destroyed, and its gates could be closed. But Vecna is something else entirely. He can act from a distance, can strike anywhere at any time, can manipulate people psychologically before killing them physically. He commands vast forces through the hive mind, has the entire Upside Down as his power base, and possesses abilities that rival Eleven's at her strongest. Defeating Vecna will require more than simple force. It will require understanding his psychology, his philosophy, his fundamental worldview, and finding weaknesses within it. Music proved effective at disrupting his control over Max, suggesting that emotional connections and memories can serve as anchors against his psychic assault. Coordinated attacks on multiple fronts wounded him, implying that he can be hurt if caught between threats he must divide his attention to address. His physical form in the Creel House is vulnerable, as Nancy's shotgun blast proved, meaning he's not invulnerable despite his power. But perhaps the most important weakness in Vecna's armour is his certainty. He believes absolutely in his own superiority, in the righteousness of his philosophy, in the inevitability of his victory. This makes him arrogant, prone to underestimating his opponents, because he cannot conceive of prey genuinely threatening a predator. He dismissed Max's resilience, was surprised when 11 proved strong enough to challenge him, didn't anticipate the coordinated assault on his physical form. These miscalculations stem from his fundamental contempt for humanity and his conviction that ordinary people cannot possibly pose a real threat to something as evolved as himself. The final confrontation between Vecna and the protagonists of Stranger Things will likely centre on this clash of worldviews. Vecna sees humans as weak, artificial, constrained by meaningless structures and comfortable lies. The heroes of the story, through their actions and sacrifices, will need to prove that human connection, love, sacrifice and determination are not weaknesses but strengths. That the bonds people form with each other, the structures they create to support and protect one another, the moral frameworks that guide their actions. These aren't illusions hiding from harsh reality, but rather the truest expressions of what it means to be human. Vecna may be powerful, may command forces beyond anything his opponents can match in raw strength, may possess abilities that make him seem godlike in his reach and influence. but he has isolated himself utterly, exists as a consciousness cut off from genuine connection to anything except through domination and control. He has sacrificed every aspect of his humanity to gain power, and in doing so has made himself fundamentally alone in a way that perhaps even he doesn't fully comprehend. The heroes facing him are weaker individually but stronger collectively, vulnerable in ways he can no longer be vulnerable, but also capable of things he can never understand or access. Conclusion: a monster complete. The story of Vecna is the story of a child who was different, who possessed abilities that set him apart and made him dangerous, who chose to embrace the darkness within himself rather than fight against it. Henry Creel could have been many things. He could have been a hero, using his gifts to help others and make the world better. He could have been a cautionary tale, someone whose powers corrupted him despite good intentions. He could have been a tragedy, a victim of circumstances and abuse who broke under pressure and did terrible things he later regretted. Instead, he became Vecna, a monster who chose every step of his path, who murdered without remorse, who spent years planning the destruction of human civilization, who transformed himself into something utterly inhuman and revelled in that transformation. From the dry deserts of Nevada to the nightmare realm of the Upside Down, from a sensitive boy to an interdimensional horror, Henry Creel's journey is complete. What he will do next, how he will continue his campaign against humanity, and whether he can ultimately be stopped, these are questions the final season of Stranger Things will need to answer. But one thing is certain: Vecna represents the ultimate villain, a threat that combines physical power, psychic abilities, strategic intelligence, and absolute conviction in a philosophy that sees human suffering as not just acceptable but necessary. He is the nightmare that lurks beneath the surface of reality, the predator waiting in the dark, the monster that was once human, but chose to become something far worse. Understanding his origins doesn't make him sympathetic or diminish his evil. It simply reveals the depths of horror possible when power is divorced from conscience, when intelligence serves only destruction, when choice leads inexorably toward darkness. The name Vecna will echo through Hawkins for as long as anyone survives to remember it. The grandfather clock will appear in their nightmares, counting down hours and minutes and seconds toward an end none of them can avoid forever. And somewhere in the twisted mirror of the Upside Down, suspended in his web of vines within the corrupted Creel House, the monster waits and plans and knows with absolute certainty that eventually, inevitably, he will win, because that's what predators do. They wait, they hunt, they kill. And Vecna has proven himself to be the apex predator in any reality he inhabits. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the origins and psychology of Stranger Things' most terrifying villain, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more lore explorations. There are countless stories waiting to be told, countless mysteries to unravel, countless nightmares to examine in detail. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, if you start seeing a grandfather clock where one shouldn't be, run. Time is running out.